The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the fourth day of this 7-day sesshin here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And things are going along swimmingly. I want to share some thoughts about training because, well, there's a lot that goes on in training, all the way from the actual physical plant to what we do with our mind and how we continue the training outside of the zendo. Since I've trained for many years in both the Soto form and the Rinzai form, I have a sense of what works for my students in terms of the format, in terms of just how the zendo is set up and that kind of thing, the physical arrangement, because they differ significantly between Soto and Rinzai forms. In the Soto sect, the sitting is done facing the wall. The idea, I'm sure, being that if you don't have things distracting your field of vision, you are perhaps better able to enter within and do your inner practice, because practice is about exploring within. It's not about exploring outside. What this can do is in my experience at any rate, is to set up something of a dichotomy between practice and daily life. And our practice is meant to be 24/7, really. It's meant to go not just from the cushion, but continuing on beyond when we're on the cushion. And it's vital because practice isn't about something called awakening that you experience when you're in the zendo and on the cushion. And then the rest of the time you just go about your daily life in the same old ways, causing the same old suffering and pain. That's not what practice is about. Practice really is what we call here a 360-degree practice in every aspect of our life. And in order to do that more effectively, in my experience, we sit with the Rinzai form, which is facing into the room, so that rather than a blank wall that you're looking at, which, by the way, you can fill with all kinds of images. I know that one from personal experience. But we're also facing other people in the zendo. There are things in our field of vision. And that's much more how it is in daily life. Most of us don't live in a blank-walled environment 24/7, unless we're in solitary confinement in a prison. And that some people find a way of encountering liberation, but that's rare. Most people find it as a way of going crazy. And I'm not saying that the Soto form is wrong. I'm saying that in my experience and with my particular students, sitting Rinzai is more effective. When we are facing each other, when we have other things in our field of vision, we have to work harder, usually, to focus our minds on our practice, because there are distractions. And of course, facing the wall, we can invent a tremendous amount of distraction. There were a number of times, there was a period I went through in relatively early practice where, and facing that blank wall, because I did Soto practice first, I found myself staring at pictures so intense that I found myself wondering if the guy sitting next to me in sesshin could see them too. And then I also ended up with hearing makyo too, sound makyo, where I found myself in a cafe, and within that cafe, it's a fairly large room, and there were round tables, and there were groups of people at each table. And each table, they were speaking a different foreign language. And even though there were no foreign languages that I had ever encountered, I knew that they were legitimate foreign languages. And I was sitting there in the zendo, listening to these conversations, trying to discern what people were saying, until I realized what was going on. And then I worked mightily to let go that whole illusion. I used to design furniture in the zendo. I mean, there are a lot of ways we can entertain ourselves facing a blank wall or a blank screen. It's meant, of course, as an aid to practice. The challenge can be that once you're finished with the intensive period of practice, say a sesshin, then you go out into the outside world, and all of a sudden, boom, everything is incredibly intense and technicolor, and it can be a shock, and it can be hard to keep the practice going in the face of that shock. With the Rinzai system, particularly as it was practiced at Sōgen-ji, which when Hakuin visited it centuries ago, because the daimyo who donated his country place to become a temple, which ultimately became Sōgen-ji, his Buddhist teacher was Hakuin. Hakuin went to visit him a number of times, and there are several scrolls that Hakuin had written that are in the possession of Sōgen-ji. At the time, it was pretty remote. It's located at the base of a mountain. When the great storms took place, hurricanes in the west, and then it was said that the sea lapped at the gates of Sōgen-ji. Well, now it's all been filled in, and there are houses built. You could ride for several minutes before you actually get to the edge of the sea where it is now. But now it's right in the middle of things. And right in the middle of things in a very busy public life. Even though there are sesshin there, and we are cloistered during sesshin, we are not to go out of the temple during sesshin, but plenty of people come in and wander about, and sometimes poke their heads into the zendo while we're sitting and have to be asked not to come in. It's a very public place. It's almost looked at by the Japanese public as a kind of a garden, a public garden. So not only that, but when we are in sesshin at Sōgen-ji, whoever is the daily tenzo, and the way it's set up is that there's a sort of a tenzo position, and then during sesshin, various parts of the community, various members of the community, each one at a time, and sometimes multiple times, depending on how many people are at the sesshin, becomes a daily tenzo. So each day, a daily tenzo changes, but there's still a supervising tenzo who is responsible for providing the basic things, like making sure there are pickles for each meal, and so on and so forth, the running of the kitchen in general. And each tenzo is the first person to zazen every morning and the first person to zazen every evening. And the tenzo of the day goes to the morning chanting, which begins at 4 a.m. and goes till 5 a.m. and then immediately goes to set up the zazen room and the zazen waiting room, and then goes to the kitchen to start the breakfast and serves as the breakfast person and the lunch person and the supper person, and answers the telephone and answers the doorbell. And daily, there are multiple people coming to the temple, both to donate things to the temple, food or whatever. And also, many people go on pilgrimage. And there are pilgrimage routes in Japan, many of them. And you have this little book that you carry with you. And at each temple on the pilgrimage, you go and ask for a stamp in the book to verify that you've been there. And so people are coming and asking, and they're asking where the ohaka is, the graveyard. They're asking if you would please stamp their book. They're asking other questions, and the same way with the telephone. So the tenzo of the day has to keep the practice going in the midst of activity, in the midst of planning the meals, because you walk into the kitchen that day, or you might have a little bit of view the night before, after the end of the evening sitting. You can go into the kitchen and see what vegetables and what food is available to put together for breakfast. Well, breakfast is always the same. It's rice gruel, okayu, and a vegetable soup, and basically the condiments around that. And lunch, again, always rice, and then at least one vegetable concoction, usually 2 or 3. And then supper, when I was living there, was actually a formal meal, but it changed eventually to becoming an informal meal where there was a very short period of time, 20 minutes or something like that, when the kitchen was open, leftovers were set out, and you could go and you could eat if you want, or you could do other things in that very short 20 minutes. The schedule is very intense at Sōgen-ji, so to have even 20 minutes to brush your teeth and take a cat nap was miraculous. So many people did not do supper, but it was available. And then after that, the tenzo of the day had to clean the kitchen, including scrubbing the floors, and again, set up for zazen, first to zazen, continue to respond to the telephone and the doorbell, and so it went. And then the next day, they just rejoined the sesshin as a regular practitioner. So you had this wonderful opportunity to have to keep your practice going to the point where you could appear in zazen, and there was no question. You produced in zazen. You worked your rear end off so that you could offer some deeper response than the last time you were in zazen. There was no option to say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't have time today to memorize my koan. Some of those koans, some of those subsequent koans were pages in length. And you might not have more than a few minutes to memorize them. And they had to be memorized. You couldn't walk in and read it. So there was a lot of right on the edge, very focused opportunity there. And as well, this fact that you're in the midst of activity, in the midst of a sesshin where you have to continue your practice, even when you are in the midst of activity. You can't daydream getting the breakfast. You can't focus on something else. And there was no connectivity to speak of. So forget trying to do email or anything else. If you had a chance, you might dare run out and take a shower, because it's beastly hot and sweaty in Japan in the summertime. But essentially you have to keep it together. And it's wonderful practice, really, really wonderful practice. It's challenging practice because we're not used to focusing our mind so fully, so much of the time. And yet that is what is important. We sit zazen with the luxury of focusing our mind on this inner quest, this inner exploration for who we really are. And then when the sitting ends, or the sesshin ends, we go about our daily life. And if we don't work to keep the practice going during that time, and that doesn't mean going around more or less up in a cloud with this idea that we are practicing. It means being so fully, totally present with whatever we're doing that whoever is doing it disappears. There's only the phenomenally amazing doing of it. And when we are that present, it is phenomenal. It is amazing. We don't feel that amazed in daily life ordinarily because we're not ordinarily that focused. We're not ordinarily that present. And yet when you experience true presence, then it's miraculous, really. It's miraculous. There's time, there is space, there is joy, there is a natural unfolding of the day, the life, the universe. And this is vital. Why did we come into this world if not to find out who we really are and to uncover and enable fully our innate compassion and wisdom? Sure, I would say pretty much all of us are able to be caring and understanding a lot of the time. But when it comes to being able to do that 24/7 and 100% of the time, and 100% compassionate, and 100% understanding, and 100% wise, and 100% let go so much that we respond to the circumstances freely, clearly, and quite well when we are free and clear. Most of us don't do that. Yet that's our potential. And we can, and the world will be so much a better place when we do. And our practice really is about helping us uncover that beingness that we are, that incredible beingness that can manifest in everything we do or say or think. But we are sort of under a pile of conditioning, and it drives us. It drives us to react. It drives us to have all kinds of emotions up, down, and all around, and to be anxious, to be angry, to be judgmental. All of which tends to interfere with our ability to flow with life in a harmonious way. So it's important to bring the practice into daily life. And here I'd like to share again some more from the teachings of Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, again from this book, As It Is. And in a chapter called Mingling Practice with Daily Life, he says, in the context of the view of Mahamudra, Dzogchen, and the Great Middle Way, you do not make any essential distinction between sessions and breaks. That means when you're on the cushion and when you're walking around and doing other things in your daily life. You do not have to divide the practice, making one practice for the meditation state and another for the post-meditation. Here, the meditation state lasts up until one is distracted from awareness and then turns into the post-meditation. And that's a key. Even on the cushion, we can be in the meditation state and suddenly find ourselves distracted in the post-meditation state, even right there on the cushion. Presence, presence, presence. This is the key. And it's presence with whatever is going on in our bodies. We drop out of the thinking mind to the degree that we can, and increasingly as we tune into our bodies, it becomes more and more possible. And the result is we become more and more free of the tyranny of thought. Now, that said, usually when we have a period of time, at least in the earlier years of practice, when we have a period of time where we are relatively free of thought, where we are able to engage deeply within in this inner exploration, ever more subtle, then we leave the sesshin or some other transition, and suddenly it's like all hell breaks loose. This is a kind of an ego backlash. It's the part of you that is fighting to maintain the status quo, lobbying very hard to take you off course. It's like in the story of the Buddha's enlightenment, when he sits down and he's determined to find the answer he's sought for 6 years already through ascetic practice as to why there is suffering in the world. And the illusion Mara comes to him and first brings his beautiful daughters to dance before the Buddha and try to entice him away. And that doesn't work. So then he brings out his illusionary hordes of demons who hurl boiling mud and spears and lances at him. And this is a real metaphor for the kind of pain we can experience, physical pain we can experience in zazen if our bodies are not accustomed to sitting in the forms we're usually going to be sitting in the zendo. And that's another benefit to having a Rinzai form in the zendo, is that we have recently built tons, the raised platforms, as are traditional in all monasteries, whether they're Rinzai or Soto, in Japan. And the fact that we sit facing into the room means that if you choose to do so, and this is quite legitimate, you can sit on the tan with your feet down on the floor as if you're sitting in a chair. There's some benefits to that. Zazen is not meant to be physical punishment. But if we surf the ego backlash and keep working to stay present, it'll subside and we will find ourselves deeper, more free than we were before because of the work that went on. And another thing about difficult times in zazen, we often come to the conclusion, which is not a correct conclusion normally, that when we're having a difficult time focusing on the practice, or even not being distracted all the time, or being caught in pain and all the rest of that, we assume it means we're doing bad practice. It could mean the absolute opposite. Because when things are challenging, you have to work harder to try to bring them back to ground. And that working harder pays off. And suddenly it becomes easier to practice. We are able to be more focused, and it seems like, whew, finally, I've gotten to a place where I can practice. Well, that's actually quite a dangerous position, because in finally being able to practice with some level of ease and lack of challenge, we tend to tread water. We tend to subtly let go the commitment to practice. So relieved that finally I'm not battling all those things in my mind. Now I can relax a bit. Well, it's not about relaxing a bit, nor is it about being tense. It's about continuing to focus regardless of what it feels like in your mind. Because actually, those times when it is more difficult, those are the times where there is the greatest potential for going deeper. So don't despair if things are feeling challenging to you, and beware if they are feeling like quite nice. Hakuin talked about the cave of dead sitting, where we reach a point where we sort of enter into a kind of an eddy, a place where the stream is not so strong, where we can kind of relax and hang out. And it often is accompanied by a really nice feeling in our mind. And we think that that might even be on the way to enlightenment, if not enlightenment itself. That's a huge mistake. This is what, as I said, he called the cave of dead sitting. It's not a place of being able to really go deeper. It's a stuck place, and you don't want to hang out there. If you find yourself there, you don't want to hang out there. This is not about making the practice into something difficult and unpleasant at all. We have enough of that already. It's about if you find yourself in a place that really feels lovely, be careful. Be really careful. It could be that cave of dead sitting, and you don't want to be there. To continue with Urgyen Rinpoche. You do not have to divide the practice, making one practice for meditation state and another for post-meditation. Here, the meditation state lasts up until one is distracted from awareness, and then turns into the post-meditation. And actually, the training is exactly the same, regardless of whether you sit, walk, eat, talk, lie down, or move around. The moment you remember to recognize, you see immediately how mind essence is. You see emptiness. Well, you see emptiness if you've been practicing for long enough. In the beginning, it's not necessarily so. But, and believe me, emptiness is only a beginning. Emptiness is not awakening. Emptiness is an aspect of reality, but you have to go through the whole gamut to really be awakened. Actually, the training is exactly the same, regardless of whether you sit, walk, eat, talk, lie down, or move around. The moment you remember to recognize, you see immediately how mind essence is. You see emptiness. It does not make any difference if you recognize while you're standing or sitting, while you're eating, talking, or moving about. Being undistracted is the session. Being undistracted is the section. Being distracted is the break. When he speaks of undistracted, that means as deep into presence as possible. And of course, particularly early on, things are going to pop up and interfere with that being totally present. And you keep on going. You keep on working. You keep on searching for who you really are, for what that mu is, for that face before your parents were born, for that true person of no rank that Rinzai speaks of. And Urgyen Rinpoche says a little bit more. The duration of seeing mind essence cannot possibly last for a long time right now, because you're beginners in this recognition of self-existing wakefulness. Any success in keeping a long stretch of meditation state cannot be anything other than an imitation, a fabrication, which is precisely what we don't need to trade in. So again, and this tends to underscore why it's so important to work with a teacher, because we can easily convince ourselves that we've had some level of awakening when actually we have most likely dissociated or are in some kind of dream state. Keep working, keep working. Don't assume a thing about your practice. Don't judge it and don't assume anything. Just keep doing it, exploring that inner beingness, exploring the nuances of what goes on in your body, letting go the thoughts by paying more attention to your body, reaching through the out breath, even if you're working on a koan, extending that out breath and reaching through it to really enable that yearning that brought you to practice to begin with, that sense that there is something that you can realize that's this beyond ordinary perception. Don't hang on to anything, which is, of course, easier said than done. Continuing. Rather, repeat again and again the short moment of true wakefulness. You know from attending school that you learn because you put your mind to it. In the beginning, it was difficult, and then it became easier. All training is like that. We, like all sentient beings, have gotten used to negative habits, even though we have the nature of Samantabhadra. The Samantabhadra is a manifestation of Buddha. Since we do not know this, we are governed by habitual tendencies. Since we don't know it, we're governed by habitual tendencies. And these habitual tendencies are habit patterns, and they drive us into reactivity. They drive us into pain and suffering. And the more we can unweave those tendencies, the freer we will become of pain and suffering. It's as simple as that. It takes a great deal of work, but you guys are good at it. You've got everything you need in order to do it effectively. So let's continue. Thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.